Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer. Buddha at the Gas Pump is an ongoing series of interviews with spiritually awakening people. There have been over 365 of them now, and if this is new to you, go to batgap.com, B-A-T-G-A-P, and check out the past interviews menu where you'll see them organized in various ways. Also, this whole production is made possible by the support of appreciative viewers and listeners, and so if you appreciate it and if you feel like supporting it in any amount, there's a PayPal button on every page of batgap.com, and we appreciate those who have been supporting it. And part of their support has gotten me out to California for the Science and Non-Duality Conference, which starts tonight. But first, today, I'm going to interview my good friend, Michael Rodriguez. I say good friend even though we just met in person last night, because for quite a few months we've been corresponding by email, including a couple of friends in the correspondence, such as David Buckland and Susanna Marie. And we really felt an affinity from the start and had very lively conversations, which in preparation for this interview, Michael had the kindness to consolidate into a series of notes, and a little bit later in the conversation we'll go through those notes and make sure we've covered them all, because there's really some juicy stuff in there, and I think you're going to find this a very interesting conversation. Michael's a very bright guy with a very dedicated background both to his traditional education and to his spiritual education. So that's what we're going to start talking about first of all, is your background, how you ended up where you are today.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show.
You're welcome.
I'm really honored.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Well, if we were talking about the story of Michael, I would say that that begins really when I was a kid, around 6 or 7 years old, when I had a spontaneous question arise, which was, when you get to the edge of the universe, what is on the other side? Mm-hmm. And somehow that made an indelible impression on the psyche and really initiated a lifelong quest to discover what's true. Somehow that was endemic to the way my mind works, that sort of questioning, and it led me eventually onto a conscious spiritual quest. The next big moment, I would say, is when I had in high school a teacher as a senior in my English class.
So wait a minute, 6 or 7 you had a conscious spiritual quest?
6 or 7 I'd say that was the first glimmer of the conscious spiritual quest.
Huh.
Prior to that, there was no wondering, reflecting.
Yeah.
There was no sense of being on a path.
Yeah.
But somehow that.
But once you had that little glimmer, you just couldn't forget it. There was.
I couldn't forget it. It somehow was a necessary precursor to getting the ball rolling. Mm-hmm. And ironically, the work, or perhaps not ironically, it's quite fitting that the work I do now really directly addresses that question, but not from a traditional materialist standpoint. But
what question does it address? The
question of what is real, what is the reality of the universe, is there something that's quote unquote on the other side? So the way that I work now is to start from the experiential realization of boundless awareness or consciousness itself. I use those two words synonymously, although sometimes I make a distinction between them for pedagogical purposes, which we can talk about too. But essentially, the realization ultimately was that there is no boundedness to whatever this is. And so somehow the mind had posed a question when I was a child that was insoluble to the mind, but that was, in a sense, solvable experientially, much later, and after decades of searching and seeking and wondering and self-inquiry.
Okay, so you had this great English teacher in high school, as did I. For some reason, English teachers were always the best.
They were.
You know, even though I didn't go on to become an English major in college or anything, but they had the most intelligence and sensitivity and
Yes.
thoughtfulness.
They do.
In my experience.
Yeah, there's a heartful quality
Yeah.
to a really good English teacher.
Yeah.
Because they understand the soul.
Mm-hmm.
Literature is really a spiritual, in my experience, is really a spiritual exercise. Reading literature, reflecting on it, becoming one with it, memorizing it in order to really get the essence of a poem or a passage. It's a spiritual discipline in itself. And in fact, we find this even in spiritual traditions like in Christianity, they have Lectio Divina, divine reading, which is taking a passage from a scripture from the Bible in that case and meditating on it. In my experience, that was always part of the process, as a kind of Lectio Divina with classic literature.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing it also with spiritual literature, but somehow that was built into the way that I approached it.
Seems like with literature there would be as much variation in the spiritual depth of it as there is among people in general. I mean, some people are just rather crude and superficial, and others are very deep and insightful. And you know, look at books today that are available. I suppose maybe what qualifies something as really classic literature is that there is some depth to it, and you had your pulp fiction novels back in the 1600s, but they didn't stand the test of time.
Right.
Is that true?
That's part of it.
Yeah.
They ask certain perennial questions that have no definitive answer, because they're really plumbing the depths of the psyche and of the soul, and there's no end to that. So if you read the great literary figures, you can never finish reading a great piece of literature.
Mm-hmm.
Just like you can never finish reading, say, the Bhagavad Gita.
Sure, because
or
there's
the Bible.
levels and levels
Absolutely.
and levels.
And no matter how much you think you know about it, as you continue to develop in a relative sense and go back to these texts, you see deeper and deeper levels that you missed for the first 20, 30 years sometimes.
Until perhaps you surpass the depth of the author, if that, you think?
Well, the depth of the author makes no difference in the sense that the text itself is kind of an autonomous being.
Doesn't it reflect his state of consciousness, though? You read Shakespeare, doesn't it go as deep as Shakespeare was, and then...
which is infinite.
He in particular, or everyone?
No, everyone, of course, but the creativity that someone like that brings to a text has no limits. So you could read Hamlet forever and never exhaust its potential meaning. Just like you could read the Bible for the rest of your life and never quite pin down Jesus to be this rather than that.
Right.
Because a literary text is alive. It's not a dead, inert thing. The experience of reading a text is a living experience. And you're always changing. So the text changes with you because it's a meeting.
Some people feel that great composers like Beethoven and Mozart were divinely inspired, that they were just sort of conduits for something much deeper that wanted to be expressed in the world. Do you feel like that may be true of writers also?
I think it's true of all artists. That creative impulse comes from the unknown. Beethoven marveled at it himself. Mozart didn't know where these tunes came from. He would wake up and a whole symphony would be in his mind.
In a flash,
In a flash.
and then it just had to take the
All
time
he
to
had
write
do was
it
to
down.
write it down.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's a mystery.
Yeah.
And no one can claim to understand that. In a sense, it's a mystery as grand and as ineffable as the creation of anything. It all comes from the same source. And I think that artists are aware of that. And so even though you could create anything and it would still be coming from the source, artists are consciously, in a sense, conduits for that which is transcendent.
Right.
And when it comes through, when it breaks through from the realm of the uncreated to the created, it's permeated and saturated with its origin.
Yeah.
And somehow that communicates to us. And we all know this. There's nothing terribly grandiose about what I'm saying. I think everybody knows this when they encounter beauty. It's universal human experience.
Nice. So you ended up going on to get 4 degrees, 3 master's degrees.
2.
2 master's degrees and a PhD.
Right.
What's the fourth? The bachelor's degree? Counting that among your 4?
Yeah,
That doesn't count.
no, it doesn't count. Accurate.
So your master's degrees were in literature and...
Yeah, no, one of them is in Irish literature,
Uh-huh.
and one of them is in comparative religion.
Okay.
And then the PhD is in literature as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a thrill for many years. As I graduated high school and found myself in college and enjoying very much the study of literature, I felt very alive and as though I were following my dharma. Just felt very normal and natural that I would be studying this and that I would go on hopefully one day to teach it. I wanted to teach as well as my high school teacher had taught. And I had seen Dead Poet Society,
Oh, yeah.
which had an enormous impact on me. That
Yeah.
movie really transformed the way that I saw the world and instigated, brought out of me this desire to be of service in that way.
Mm.
To express my passion in a way that would help wake students up to their own divine potential. And I couldn't always speak of it in spiritual terms, but that was always the subtext.
Yeah.
That each of us has infinite potential, and if we can somehow tap into that through great literature, that would be something really divine.
Mm.
That literature helps us discover, as Robert Frost said, it helps us discover what we didn't know we knew.
That's good.
Which always stuck with me. There's levels that we do know, but we're not conscious of it.
Sure.
And so literature makes us conscious of, ultimately, consciousness itself, which for me is the great realization that it's consciousness that is conscious. And when we actually look for it, we can't find it, despite the fact that it is undeniably present and conscious.
Mm. I think it's worth mentioning that, in my opinion, we each possess, what we might call the home of all knowledge, deep
Yes.
within our awareness.
Yes.
Kind of a vast repository of energy, intelligence, creativity, wisdom,
Yeah.
all of that. And, most people just sort of tap into just a tiny fraction of it.
Yes.
and try to live their lives on that basis.
Yes.
It's as if we're all walking around multi-millionaires, and
Yes.
yet we're begging at street corners, because
Yes.
we've forgotten we have that bank account.
Yeah, it's the difference between being satisfied with relative knowledge, which is the norm, and we assume that that's true knowledge.
And getting some little fragment
Yes.
of it, because that's all
Right.
you can get
That's
in a
all you can
lifetime.
get. And most people live at that level.
Mhm.
And the level that you're describing so beautifully right now is the repository
Right.
of where relative knowledge, speaking of literature, where relative knowledge flows from. And ultimately, the only thing that can satisfy the yearning for absolute knowledge, which is there, and we mistake for relative knowledge, is the recognition, the direct realization of the repository, the source from which all relative knowledge flows. And that instills in us the peace that passeth all understanding.
Yeah.
And I think everyone is in search of that. And it's described differently in different traditions, it's verbalized differently, but the source is simple and single, and it's universal.
Yeah. The Upanishads have this one, I forget which Upanishad, but they say something like, it's not for the sake of the wife that the wife is dear, but for the sake of the self the wife is dear. It's not for the sake of wealth that the wealth is dear, but for the sake of the self that the wealth is dear. And it goes on and ticks off a number of things that people might strive after in life, and makes the point that whatever satisfaction we derive from external things is just a sort of a paltry reflection
Yes.
of the ocean of fulfillment that
Yeah.
resides within.
Yes. And it's here.
Which is not to say we shouldn't enjoy the external
No.
things, but without also tapping into that ocean of fulfillment that resides
Yes.
within, we're really shortchanging ourselves.
Yeah, and in a sense, it seems when we're talking about it like this, so theoretical and far off, but it's here, it's always here. This presence that does not come or go, this ocean of knowing and of being, which are synonymous. So this sense of being is it has an intrinsic knowing quality, although when we go deeply into what that means, even that description that I just gave is paltry, because it's prior even to that concept. It's prior to any concept or idea or experience even. It's prior to everything, but it's here, not prior in time, but just prior to the first movement out by mind. Right. It's here. And the irony of this spiritual quest is that the whole thing takes place here. It's all a mental movement that has no substance or reality to it. And it's just a simple noticing. Although it doesn't seem so simple when we're struggling to try to understand who we are.
So Michael, we talked a bit about your fascination with, or your love of literature, and your academic pursuit of that. And we talked a bit about when you were 7, you had this spiritual experience that really got you thinking about the deeper questions. But obviously, you know, skipping forward, you're a dedicated spiritual teacher now, and that's your primary focus. Yeah. So how did your interest in spirituality emerge in the midst of your academic life and eventually eclipse it?
It's a great question. And emerge is a good word because it really did emerge out of the academic work. When I was in college, I had 2 professors, in particular, subsequently became dear friends of mine, who introduced me to the wisdom of the East. And one of my professors had been a student of Tony Packer's, who was initially Philip Kapleau's Dharma heir, and then broke from him when she had encountered Krishnamurti's work, and really started her own bare bones meditation center in upstate New York. So I had met Philip Kapleau when I was in college, and had gone to some retreats of his when he was down in Florida, Hollywood, Florida, during his retirement. And I just fell in love with Zen immediately. And I just felt a deep, kindred, karmic connection. Yeah. And as though it had been in my blood for lifetimes. So as soon as I met him, there was a deep resonance. I had read the 3 Pillars of Zen by Kapleau, had that under my arm when I went to meet him the first time, and it was a very powerful experience, and that led to the beginning of really a 20-year commitment to Zazen, to sitting, meditation, and working with Tony Packer for a number of years in retreats, and that was all going on simultaneously with the academic work. So whatever I was doing in my classes was dovetailing with the experiential aspect in retreats and sessions and other work with particularly Tony Packer for a long period of time, who was my main teacher early on, and learned so much from her.
As a college professor teaching literature, were you subtle about your fascination with Zen and spiritual teachings, or did you just bring it right in there and refer to it explicitly?
That's a great question. A little of both. In academia, one has to be careful about what you say, which was one of the reasons I ended up not feeling comfortable in it. But there were courses that I would teach in theology, for instance, or religion and literature, where I could explore these topics more overtly, but it was often in the context of talking about literature and spirituality more in an implicit sense. Right. But it always came through somehow. Yeah. And that's what's interesting. No matter what I taught, the spirit of the inquiry that I was personally engaged in would somehow manifest itself. And it often manifested itself in my passion as a teacher. One of the most common reports I would get from students was how passionate I was. And there's something about passion that's infectious. Yeah. And I experienced it with my own English teacher. You probably did too in high school with yours. But there was something that communicates in that and that speaks to students.
Did many of your students actually get interested in spirituality? Did you
They
light
did.
a fire under a lot of them?
I did.
Yeah.
Where I've had students come back to me and say that the class with me inspired them to go to divinity school.
Wow.
Or study to become a religion major in college.
Mm-hmm.
I did get that. And I also had students come back to me and say that every week they came to class, they felt like it was their therapy session. I actually got that a lot.
Huh.
It was a common theme, although I would never talk about that.
Right.
But that was the flavor of a lot of the classes. There was a sense of sharing, of talking about life, and applying the literature to real life situations. And so I would always talk anecdotally about whatever I was learning in my own life and how I was applying some of the lessons that were coming out of the literature, because I do feel that literature helps us live a better life,
Mm-hmm.
helps us to know who we are, essentially like any great spiritual text.
Yeah.
They help us understand who we are, and in an ultimate sense, who we are absolutely, which is beyond the name and the form.
Mm-hmm.
But that, and you can get that sort of message in some of the deeper literature by Shakespeare, or even someone like Samuel Beckett, who might not initially seem like a spiritual writer, but in my view, is deeply spiritual because he was concerned first and foremost with human suffering and the relief from suffering, and glimmers of truth that come through Beckett's writing here and there. And I was always eager to communicate that to the students, that, those glimmers of truth that were coming through even the darkest of literature.
So, you've alluded to the fact that you eventually became disillusioned with the academic life.
Yeah.
My guess is that kind of snuck up on you like a thief in the night. Incrementally, it didn't hit you. You didn't wake up one morning and think, oh, I can't do this. But it must have begun to gnaw at you more and more.
It did. Over a long period of time, it started to become less and less fulfilling. Because my heart really was moving more and more as my own personal journey was developing, in the relative sense. It was becoming more and more consuming, and it was difficult for me to talk about anything other than that.
Were there many of your peers who appreciated what you were doing, or were you kind of a fish out of water?
Fish out of water. There were maybe one or two who were on a similar kind of path, and they were very dear, close friends, but only a couple. For the most part, it was a very heady environment. And I was finding as I was going deeper into my own truth that I was dropping more and more from the head to the heart and to the felt sense of being. And it's very difficult to teach in an academic environment unless you're in your head. That's what it is.
That's what it is, right.
For the most part.
You're not just singing Kumbaya.
Well, yeah, and right. And there's not much of a container for truth beyond the mind. I mean, it really is meant to fill students with relative knowledge and then to get them to spit that back in one way or another, either on tests or in their writing. And it's a very structured, formulaic kind of system that started to feel less and less true and authentic to me because I wanted my students I wanted them to be free. And I found myself holding them to standards academically that didn't feel good to me. Judging them on their writing and being forced to give them grades that didn't necessarily reflect what they were getting out of the class, but they didn't conform necessarily to the rubrics that we had set forth. So it was not it didn't feel good. It was not in alignment, I would say, with who I was and what I wanted for my students, which was for them to find out who they were, who they truly were. And so that self-inquiry was always a part of everything I did. And I always wanted them to deconstruct everything they thought they knew. I was always trying to help them to come out of their conceptions and their ideations and their beliefs about who they were, and trying to lead them more into an inquiry about the nature of themselves, the self, in the truest sense. And everything I did, whether it was Emerson or Thoreau or T.S. Eliot or Wallace Stevens or Shakespeare, Robert Frost, it was always geared towards self-knowledge. So it was a very natural movement for me to leave academia eventually, after a decade of teaching full-time at the university level, and to share in a different way. And I feel now like I'm really drawing on the deep reservoir of potential in myself to be of service, to be helpful to people who are there for that specifically.
Yeah.
People come because they're suffering and they want to know who they really are, beyond identification with thoughts and emotions and body.
It's interesting, your point about academia being very heady,
Yeah.
intellectual. And most people say, yeah, oh, that's what it's supposed to be. But it's interesting to contrast that with the traditional Gurukula in India, where there's intellectual knowledge being presented, there's devotion and love and respect for the teacher among the students, and from the teacher to the students. There's that mutual love and heart level thing that's very explicitly cultured. There's service in terms of some kind of work that contributes to the community and so on. So it's kind of more multifaceted. It's as if it takes into account all of one's faculties as a developing human being rather than just the intellect. Seems like our whole society is a little top-heavy and lacking in those other qualities.
It is.
Because of the nature of our educational system. And in fact, I mean, they're always cutting the stuff that...
The arts.
The arts and stuff that are considered frivolous and impractical.
Correct.
For earning a living.
That's right. That's right. And that's because we live in a very materialist culture.
Yeah.
That's based on the accumulation of stuff and of technology and progress in the technological sense. And unfortunately, we haven't made as much progress, perhaps, in terms of our moral and spiritual development as we have technologically, which is a dangerous place to be.
I think we're paying a price for it.
We are paying a price.
I mean, even just take any example, the environmental crisis.
Absolutely.
It's a direct reflection of the of regarding the world as a mechanistic resource that we can extract stuff from for our own benefit. And no sort of appreciation for the world as a living being, or for love of animals and nature and all that from the heart level. It's just so we're seeing the symptoms in the world of the sort of education that has been predominant.
Yes, it's one of the things I always tried to evoke in my students was awe and wonder.
Beautiful.
Which I think is very rare nowadays. We're so bombarded by so much stimulation on so many levels that we're sort of deadened to the living, vibrant reality of this moment. We're sort of stuck in our heads, or we're stuck in front of a computer screen, and we forget that this moment is alive with conscious intelligence. And as the awakening started to unfold here, that became more and more pronounced, and it ended up just swallowing up everything. That sense of conscious intelligence, that the body itself, which we think of as this thing, this lump of flesh, is actually living. It's conscious, it's intelligent, it's sensitive, it's fundamentally undefended and free. And everything is made of that. And that was one of the great awakenings here, was that it's not just the body that's conscious and intelligent, but everything that is experienced is made of that same conscious, intelligent principle, which is synonymous with our true self. Yeah.
It's ironic because even though science might be held culpable for the sort of dead mechanistic view of the world that is so predominant, on the other hand, science has enabled us to understand matter in such intricate, deep, subtle ways that if we appreciate what it's actually showing us, it evokes the sense of awe and wonder that you mentioned a little while ago. It's like you look at a single cell, you look at a grain of sand, you look at a little bug on the sidewalk, and look closely enough and you realize, what an amazing, miraculous thing. So full of intelligence, So I mean, in a way, science might be able to redeem itself by helping us come to appreciate, by being a tool, not the only tool, but a tool in our toolbox which could help us really appreciate the wonder of life more so than ever.
Hopefully. I think a good scientist has that as a foundation.
Some of the great ones
So
articulate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Einstein talked a lot about the necessity of imagination,
Right.
and of creativity,
Uh-huh.
and of wonder.
Yeah, he did.
And he had spiritual experiences. He had divine experiences of the infinite intelligence that is what we call the universe. And so if we can somehow kindle in ourselves that innate sense of wonder that we all have as children, and that somehow gets calcified by our education system primarily, and our cultural conditioning.
And just the constant onslaught of life.
Yeah, constant
numbing
onslaught
us.
of life as we know it in this modern Western culture, although it's not just Western now, it's really a worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah. I was riding home from our dinner last night that we had at the restaurant, and one of my hosts was saying that she was surprised there aren't sort of more incidents of violence in the streets and so on. She said, because life is just so intense for most people.
Yes.
You know, and I'm kind of oblivious to that living in Fairfield, Iowa, with my idyllic little existence. But she said most people are just dealing with so much, and there's so much pressure that it's a wonder that people can withstand it.
It is.
So somehow or other, you know, if that's the way it tends to be out there, you know, it begs the question: is spirituality a luxury for those who have somehow arranged their lives to have all kinds of leisure time and stuff?
No.
Or can people who are really in the thick of it get some relief and benefit from these kinds of things we're talking about?
It's beautiful. I think the latter. It's not a luxury, it's a necessity. You know, as I see it, waking up is a necessity, waking up from the dream of living you know, in separation and fear and desire and anxiety, and all of that's not practical, actually. What we think is practical is not practical. It's actually highly impractical. I mean, how well can you function when you're racked with thoughts and anxiety and fear?
Exhausted. I mean, they talk about people. Arianna Huffington's on a campaign these days just to get people to sleep a normal number of hours, because she feels like our whole society is sleep deprived, in addition to being bombarded with sensory stimuli.
We're
not really a conducive situation for deep experience.
It's not. And what we find, interestingly, when we slow down practically, I know that there are mothers out there who have children who are screaming and they have to put food on the table, and you know, they may be working 2 jobs. But there are moments in every day for all of us, even if it's 3 to 5 minutes, where if we can just drop down into the felt sense of being over and over again for small periods, that has a tremendously healing effect on the body-mind.
Yeah.
And over time, that really accumulates. Even if it's just time in the bathroom alone, or time walking to your car, or time from the car to the job, there are moments every day when everybody does have. It takes a little bit of earnestness, as Nisargadatta would say, and commitment. But what's the alternative? Pain and suffering. Yeah.
And how many hours a day does the average American watch television?
Yes.
You know, or
Which
play video games,
Yeah.
or go around looking for Pokemon Go characters or something.
Yes.
You know, if they're that age.
We do. We fritter away a lot of
So
the
there
day.
is time. It's just a matter of knowing what to do with that time and having the ability to kind of stop the rat race and tune in.
Just tune in very simply. It's like down to earth, and I'm not trying to talk about anything grandiose or abstract here. It's really a very functional, down to earth sort of, you could call it a technique, but it's just resting. Resting and dropping down, and I call it softening.
Yeah.
You know, instead of surrendering, and we could say surrender, but that has such loaded connotations, that just softening the density of the body and the mind is extremely therapeutic, as well as making the body and the mind more transparent over time to the true nature of the self, which is weightless and spaceless and timeless. It's the consciousness itself, we could say. It makes the body-mind more permeable to true nature. Although everything is true nature all the time, it's difficult to notice when the body-mind is just a series of contractions and tightness and restriction, which is not the natural state. That has become the normal state, but it's not natural to be defended and constricted and fearful unless you're in the presence of a saber-toothed tiger. But
Yeah.
we live that way all the time in situations that are not actually in any way harmful or threatening, but it's all psychologically driven.
Yeah.
So the work that I do now is very much about helping people disidentify, and there's nothing unique in this work necessarily. Hopefully I present the work in a unique way, but it's really very universal, and many teachers out there are doing wonderful work like this, but just helping people to wake up from identification with name and form.
Yeah. Now you yourself practiced Zen for 20 years. Right. And how many hours a day typically did you do that?
I was a hardcore Zen student.
Like hours a day?
Many hours a day.
Yeah.
I would just sit.
Right.
Yeah.
And retreats,
yes.
and the whole works.
Yeah.
So sometimes I see a bit of a disconnect between people like yourself, and myself for that matter, who've practiced hours a day for decades, and who then attain some degree of benefit from that, profoundly perhaps, but then turn around and say,
there's nothing to do.
Nothing to do, or just a few minutes here and there, and it's like, are people really going to attain satisfactory results unless they learn some kind of effective practice and dedicate a reasonable amount of time to it?
Right. Well, as you know, in our discussions back and forth, I tend not to be dogmatic one way or the other, and I feel free to flow between all the different levels and layers of consciousness, so that I don't get stuck anywhere, and so that I can be really available to be helpful to people wherever they think they are. So for some people, it's appropriate to have a really structured sitting practice.
Yeah.
For other people, doing it in the midst of daily living, in terms of karma yoga, is perfectly appropriate and helpful. And some people, it's a combination of the two. Some people don't need to do anything except live their life and listen to teachings and read spiritual texts, and something is happening alchemically in that process. That
attitude is kind of behind the creation of Buddha at the gas pump. I mean, the idea is to present a whole array of different teachers, and people gravitate to what's appropriate for them.
Yes.
And very often I'll put up an interview and I'll get an email from one person saying, that sucked, I didn't like, that was your worst one ever. And someone else will say, that was your best one ever, I really love that. So it's obvious that people just have different affinities.
Yes.
And no one size does not fit all.
It doesn't.
But perhaps we can make a general statement, and you can make a general statement about what one should do at the very least if one is interested in all this and just wanting to make some kind of progress.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think if that spark is there to find out what's true, to find out who you really are, I would suggest putting as much time and energy into that as you possibly can. And again, going back to Nisargadatta, my root teacher, he would call that earnestness, just being earnest, sincere, honest with oneself. That if you want to know yourself, if you want to wake up from suffering, then it's just common sense that that's what you would put your attention on. But so many of us are complacent in our suffering and kind of want to wake up, but are just kind of so comfortable in our lives that we're not really willing to give up our little luxuries.
Yeah. And we probably don't need to.
Not
we can
necessarily.
begin to just introduce a second element of something that is akin to what we're talking about here. Some practice, some teaching, some focus, some reading, just being more earnest about spirituality, and just see what ends up dropping off in your life. You might find you're not going to lose interest in your children. You're not going to lose interest in if you any sort of healthy pursuit. Probably.
Well, we don't know what's going to happen.
No, we don't. But if people are, there's this sort of stigma against spirituality that you're going to become a monk, or you're going to become aloof and detached and disinterested in your children. I was listening to some Adyashanti recordings the other day, and the woman was saying just that. She said, "I love my children more than anything in the world. I'm afraid that if I pursue this too far, I'm going to not love them anymore. I'm going to lose interest in them." So those concerns are
They do come up. And they're mind concerns. They're concerns that the mind throws up to stall the issue. They're not true. And they're just these little sort of these
doubts
that come up,
which can be dispelled.
That they can be. I mean, knowing oneself, this is the point I was trying to make, that knowing oneself is not impractical.
Right.
It actually enlivens whatever your role is in this life. If it's to be a mother, you can only be a better mother if you know who you are. You're not going to be a worse mother if you are not identified with thoughts that make you feel miserable. How could that be?
Right.
It actually will bring back life and vitality and truth and goodness in whatever we're doing, if we're called to be a mother or a cab driver or a teacher even, it could happen in any field. It's the spirit with which we're coming. It's not what we're doing. That's really secondary to the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter is really just to get clear for ourselves about what's true. And then whatever flows from that will be true. So I just am encouraging for people to be honest with themselves and in my own case, there was a point where I really had to give everything up. It was that intense for me, but it doesn't have to take that shape for everybody. And now things have come back, and so it was just a period of purification.
Yeah.
And then now there's a movement back into this role.
And when you had to give everything up, was it a leap in the dark or into an abyss, or was it more like, all right, I'm leaving the garden, but I'm entering the house?
No, it was an abyss.
Was it?
Yeah, because I didn't know, I couldn't see what was coming. And there was no security, there was no guarantee it was going to work out in a good sense, the relative sense.
Yeah.
I'd left a job that paid well and benefits, and I don't recommend that.
Right.
People have to just follow their own truth.
Yeah.
So that was my truth. But for me, it was necessary to face the fears that came up with those doomsday scenarios, being homeless and having no income and having no insurance, which is a big one that's conditioned into us, the fear of getting sick and not having a doctor to go to. What do you do then, right? And those are legitimate concerns at some level, and so I'm not dismissing them.
Sure.
But
the more responsibilities you have, the more legitimate they are. If you have 5 kids, you're just not going to walk out on them.
No, and I would never encourage that.
Right.
But at the same time, those fears do have to be faced. The fear of survival. At some level, you have to really face whatever's standing in the way of you being your authentic self. And they often revolve around money, security, and health. Yeah. Those are the big ones. Those are natural human concerns. So I bow to them. I bow to those concerns and respect them. And at the same time, if they're causing a sense of constriction in the being and a stifled sense of separation and fear, then I think that that's something that one needs to look into, just to get at the root of where does that come from, and am I really defined by that fear? But again, this is just my own path, and I never make prescriptive judgments across the board about anything, because we're all unique and we're all coming from such varied places, and so I'm always just giving provisional suggestions that people can wonder about and try out if it's true for them. Just an invitation to...
Yeah. I think a good wrap-up point for this topic is that what we're talking about with spirituality is really gaining access to the repository of all intelligence and creativity and happiness. And so even though having that enlivened in our life might end up in a reshuffling of our priorities and our activities and so on, it's generally going to go for the best if we're really contacting and attuning to that in a genuine way. It's really going to be an enhanced life. I think most people who have really gone a long distance with this, would assure you enthusiastically that they have no regrets whatsoever, even though their life might be very different now than it used to be. Like, it's really paid off. It's kind of a Jack and the Beanstalk thing, where you're really going to end up with the riches if you take the
and the riches aren't necessarily material.
No, I didn't mean to
that.
imply that. They may be. I mean, you might be more capable of earning a good living or something if you have a clearer mind and more coherent thought process. But not necessarily that.
No, and that's not the point. The point is to be true.
Yeah.
But I have found in my own life that every time there was a softening whenever a fear arose, and then following that back to from where it flowed, following it back down to the source, and not identifying with that fear, and then a moving forward regardless of it, blessings would flow.
Yeah.
And that's...
Seek ye first the kingdom of God or heaven, and all else should be added unto thee.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. But it's its own reward.
Yes, it is.
It's its own reward. That is the end in itself, is just being true. And if material, I have noticed that there has been, some amazing openings in a number of different areas in my life. One is making this work possible, and people contacting me for support and being a friend through this process. So things start to flow more synchronistically.
Yeah.
But it's never done for that purpose. It's done for its own sake. And that's its own beauty.
And I always like to take it out to the society too, because I always feel like the individual is the unit of society, and although people like yourself might be rather rare these days, there's no reason why, as things progress, people with this sort of orientation couldn't become quite the norm. And if that were the case, I think that we would see a vast reduction in the problems that beset society, because, our economic problems, our environmental problems, all that are just the reflection of all our individual activities.
Yes. Yeah, and if just each of us, anyone listening to this, can find what's true and authentic, can find and discover this pure consciousness which is here and waiting for itself to be discovered by itself. It's just consciousness recognizing itself as such. If that can happen individually, then each of us will flow from that true space in whatever way is appropriate, and that will have repercussions in the world. Yeah. That will send forth ripples that go far beyond what the eye can see. That anytime we're coming from truth, whatever flows from that is true. And so for one person, it might be taking this work into their business. They might be flowing from truth in their business and to be an enlightened entrepreneur or awakened entrepreneur. And for somebody else, it might be to be an awakened mother or an awakened bus driver or school teacher or doctor or lawyer. Each of us has our own unique path, but if it's coming from this non-dual understanding of non-separation, then whatever it is will be appropriate and true. Yeah, it's good. And helpful. For the community, for the society, for the family. It all is interconnected. Yeah. And just to reiterate, but then we'll shift to a new topic, but a lot of times this point is not brought out in spiritual circles, that this actually does have societal implications. But it does. If you just if it becomes, instead of a novelty, a boutique thing that small groups of people are into, but becomes more and more the norm, I think we're going to see vast impacts on the quality of society, and it might just be the thing that saves us from any number of things which could do us in. I think the societal implications are, in a sense, byproducts of the understanding. Definitely. It has to. You have to put the horse before the cart. Yes. It's not. I'm not saying that we should work on a social level, although that needs to be done too. But I'm just saying that secondarily, we're kind of tapping into the fuel source of human thriving, of human creativity, and you want a forest to be green. All the individual trees have to be green. So you water the root of each tree, and they start getting green. Next thing you know, you have a green forest. Yeah, and this can be tested out in everyone's life to, follow within the thread back to the sense of conscious presence, or boundless awareness, I call it. So simple. It's here. It's always here. Everything else is changing, and conscious presence is here as the reality of this moment. It's shining with boundless conscious awareness. And if there's an identification with thoughts, just to drop down with the attention into the felt sense of being. Thoughts don't have to disappear. They don't have to not be there. They're perfectly welcome to be there. But you can feel it in this moment, this presence that is scintillating with life. It is synonymous. It is life. Mm-hmm. And we're not separate. There's no separation from that. There's no I being alive. There's just this life living itself. There's no you and me in this space. If we're communicating from our heads, there's a you and a me, but if we're really coming from, it's another way of being, this coming from this more fundamental space of openness. It communicates at a heart level. And I can feel it in this moment. I don't know if that's your experience right now. Mm-hmm. And I can, sense that there are these waves on the surface of the ocean, which we call thoughts. But we're not separate as this presence. I can't find it. I know there is undeniably the presence of awareness, because even if I were to doubt the presence of awareness, that doubt would arise by virtue of the presence of awareness. Otherwise, I wouldn't be aware of it. So it's the one fact of experience, and it's the one that we overlook. And so this wonder and this awe that I was talking about earlier, I'm asking, in a sense, I'm asking whoever's interested to be astonished by the presence of awareness, to wonder about consciousness. I mean, if you really think about it, it's mind-blowing that there is consciousness. It should really stop us dead in our tracks. But consciousness falls asleep to itself as this vibrant, alive intelligence and dreams separation and kind of a otherness, deadness. And then we go through our days like a automaton. But the way that, if you just think about it this way, I put this in my book, that it's in one of the chapters, in fact, the first chapter, I was trying to point to this. The way that a video camera sees, if you were to imagine you were a video camera, just for a minute, and to look around and to see the world from the perspective of a video camera, that would be very different, wouldn't it, from the way consciousness sees. In one of them, there's a kind of a dead, inert panning without any knowing quality. But that is not the way you know.
Right.
You know as conscious being. And so there's an aliveness to knowing, and there's an aliveness to seeing and hearing and tasting and touching and smelling that we overlook. And it's available. This aliveness, this joy of being, this joy just to be. And it's built into consciousness, just the sense to be, which is the most basic level of existence, is just the sense of being. And this is not abstract, it's a fact that there is being. It's a hard fact. In fact, it's the only thing we know for sure, that I am. And then to go deeply into the sense of what that I amness is, well, it's present and aware. And this is where the heart dwells. This is the region of the heart. Ramana Maharshi talked about the heart on the right side of the chest. The left side of the chest is more of the human heart, which experiences emotion and feeling and even intuition, and opens and closes literally. And the right side of the chest is more of this space. Ramana used the right side of the chest as a kind of a metaphor for this space of awareness within which the human heart arises and subsides. Arises and subsides, contracts and expands. So this, anyway, the point is that this wide open presence of awareness is undeniably present and aware. And the human heart functions by virtue of this divine heart that we all are. And this is an enlivening, joyful realization. It sends healing energy through the body and the mind. It's actually the healing factor of the body. And any time that attention is placed on this, it grows in warmth and sensitivity. And if we're coming from this, we really can relate to other people in a way that's unifying. You know, instead of coming from I'm me and you're you, we're coming from what we share.
Yeah.
This is shared. It's not mine and it's not yours. And so why would I want to be anything other than helpful and kind if we're not separate fundamentally?
It's an important point.
Yeah.
Do unto others as you would have others do unto you, meaning has a deeper meaning, you know, because others are you.
Well, I think if we're talking about the story of Jesus, which is what you were just alluding to, there was a deep realization there of this non-dual awareness. We can see evidence of that throughout the Gospels and the sayings of Jesus, and also in the Gnostic Gospels in particular, but also in the Gospel of John. It's a very powerful, awakened being who was awake to the fact that there was no separation between the human and the divine, and between the self and the other. In Martin Buber's language, it would be the I and the thou, as opposed to I, it.
Yeah.
Usually we engage with things and people like they're objects. But if we're coming from this presence, then everything is that presence in disguise. It's appearing as what we would call a wall, but it's all saturated with being.
There's a chapter in your personal story that we haven't touched on yet, but that you've alluded to in some of our conversations, and that was a lot of purification you had to undergo. And I think probably most people on the spiritual path are going to have to go through a chapter like that, so it might be worth our discussing it for a few minutes.
Yeah, that was an important period after I left academia. It was just a really intense wondering about true nature and self-inquiry. And just as a natural byproduct of that, things started to fall away. You know, lots of toxins. The body-mind didn't want lots of toxins. I mean, it didn't want, alcohol or meat, even television and movies. Everything became very sensitive. The body-mind became like a nerve ending during this period. And I couldn't listen to regular pop music because the lyrics were just, all I could hear was codependency and just sounded so far removed from what I was discovering. Although at some point I started to listen to, and I still do, whenever I hear popular music and it's a love song, I started to listen to it like a devotional song.
Right.
So I would replace it with God or the self or consciousness.
George Harrison tried to do that. When he was really getting into God and the Beatles had broken up, and he would go to concerts and he'd say, "In my life, I loved God more," and then the audience would boo him because they wanted the original song.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. Yeah, and so there was just this period of just not wanting any toxins, visual, auditory, in any sense.
Right.
And that rendered the body much more soft and sensitive, which it always was, but this really was just coming back to that natural state, and really marinating in that felt sense of being for hours and hours at a time, which was a joy.
Yeah.
It was not onerous. I mean, it was really, it's
blissful.
pleasant. It's blissful.
Yeah.
Just to be.
Sure.
And not have to be in gear or doing or being productive in the world, just to sit and watch the clouds and to be was just utterly delightful.
Yeah.
And I was in a situation where I could do that for long periods of time, and I understand that there are some people who might not have that particular luxury, but again, there's still 3 to 5 minutes a day when you can just take the mind out of gear and just be and drop down into what it means in a felt sense to be here.
Yeah. The underlying point here, Jesus said something about not pouring new wine into old wineskins.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The body is an instrument through which awakening or enlightenment is lived.
Yes.
And there's some people who seem to dismiss the significance of having it be a fit instrument, you know. But I do think it takes a certain amount of physiological clarity. You know, the Indian tradition talks about vasanas, and
yes.
if you're full of vasanas, deep impressions, then it's not a very conducive condition for living pure awareness, pure consciousness. So all kinds of purificatory measures are prescribed to, and you know, Patanjali's got his yamas and his niyamas and so on for helping the transformation of the physiology.
Yeah, and for each of us that will be different. So for one person it might just be detoxing from drugs and alcohol, you know.
Or that might be level 1 of purification.
Yeah, I mean, we're all different. I mean, for me, it was a whole combination of things.
Yeah.
And, you know, so I don't feel to be prescriptive about that because, and I'm not suggesting that, you know, we have to have our malas and be doing prayers and austerities in that sense. But I would just say let it be natural.
I've seen people take it to extremes,
yes,
too.
I'm not suggesting
you know, where they get like, oh, I can't do anything, you know, because it'll be impure.
Yeah, I think, and that's not what I'm saying. I think, here's what I would say. Let the intelligence of the system dictate.
Tune into that.
Yes, what it is that's right for you.
Yeah.
And if each of us does that in our own unique way, and I felt that just restedness in you just now when you just did that deep sigh, which was beautiful. Just a restedness. If we can each do that more and more, it has a tremendously healing effect not only on the body mind but also on the group mind and on the group consciousness. Tremendously. I mean, a being who's in a restaurant who's at rest, you can feel that, whether you know it or not.
And if you go to some sort of satsang and there are hundreds of people in that sort of state,
absolutely.
You know,
and that was a huge thing for me, going through, you know, sitting with these beautiful beings. I went through, you know, several-year period where I did that, particularly here and through Open Circle. Just as, you know, just incredible teachers came through. They come through on a constant basis, and being able to sit with, you know, human beings who are at rest is such a gift. And so satsang is such a beautiful invitation to each of us. And if one feels called to do that, you know, really to follow that intuition, I would say just follow your own intuition and be true to it as much as possible. Because if you know, consciousness is supremely intelligent. All we have to do is listen to it. And it knows, and each of our body minds knows what it needs to heal. And if we just give that our loving, caring attention, and then just have the earnestness to be true to it, how could that go wrong?
Yeah.
How could you be a less effective human being in the world if you actually followed your intuition? And you know, the body is inherently a biofeedback system. That's what it is. It was designed to be that way.
It gives you feedback.
It gives you immediate feedback, and if it doesn't, if it's out of tune by 1/fraction of an inch, you will know it.
Yeah.
Through some uncomfortable sensation.
Yeah, it's true. And I mean, you go out and get drunk, and the next morning you feel like crap. There's a message there, and you know,
suffering is the equivalent of physical pain. Physical pain is meant to give us a clue that something needs to be.
Yeah, my hand is on the stove. Oops.
Yeah, and but we don't do that with suffering.
Yeah.
Nobody would keep their hand on the stove, right?
Right.
Because the system is smart enough to know not to do that. But why with suffering do we keep doing what we know is harmful?
Yeah.
And we don't heed the same warnings.
Sometimes in spiritual circles, people are a little bit I would say, unkind when the subject of suffering comes up. They've locked into the law of karma, as a concept, and if somebody gets cancer or something, they feel like, well, it must be their karma. But that also brings up the question of, there are all kinds of terrible suffering in the world. I mean, often due to circumstances apparently beyond one's control. Look what's happening in Aleppo these days. How is that kind of suffering a feedback mechanism for us to make any kind of change? Looks like, sometimes we just have to really grin and bear it to go through it.
Yeah, well, suffering of any kind is an invitation, and I know that it's difficult to say on
concentration camps, the really horrific stuff.
Of course, and there are people who come through that, like Viktor Frankl,
yeah,
who write Man's Search for Meaning, which is an extraordinary book.
Or Elie Wiesel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So suffering is always an invitation, even in the most extreme circumstances, to wake up. I've certainly had my own difficulties in life, and it hasn't been smooth sailing. So I think the key is to recognize that the circumstances of one's life are the way they are. For many reasons.
Yeah.
Many reasons. And a lot of this stuff happens before we're even aware of what's going on. A lot of the conditioning that's in the body-mind is conditioned before we're 5 years old, and that becomes the dominant program of our life. The way that we view the world, the way that we experience, the way that we interact and relate, all of that is very much conditioned before we're aware that that conditioning is going on. And societally, that's true too. There are infinite causes and conditions for everything that arises. So the question isn't the bare event so much as the attitude with which it's met. And if we can look at our suffering as an invitation to inquire into what's true regardless of the circumstances, it's tremendously powerful and liberating. And it could be in terms of health or money or the loss of a loved one. But it's always potentially instructive if we have that attitude, rather than a victim attitude or a poor me attitude, which is not helpful at all to anyone under any circumstance. It's never helpful.
Yeah.
So even if we find ourselves in really challenging situations, could be a medical diagnosis of some kind, then that's an invitation to really look into whatever is arising in terms of a response to that, and to inquire what's true in this moment, regardless of the circumstance. And if it's bringing up deep fear, then that's an invitation really to look into, to go into that fear and to really experience it. Because normally we do everything not to experience whatever arises in response to circumstances. And that creates a very powerful sense of separation from the experience. Now, if we can learn to soften that reactivity to experience and then inquire into it and trace it back to its source, then there's no longer a me against experience. And there's no me trying to work out experience and make it, hunky-dory.
Right.
Now, there may be time when action is needed, but if it's coming from this more true space of boundless awareness, I call it, or true nature, or consciousness, whatever, presence, then the response will be not from, going back to the Buber's I, it will become from the I, thou, a sense of non-separation from the event. So that's not that I'm having this experience and I really don't like this experience, or I'm having this experience and I really like this experience, which are both two ends of the same continuum. But to really inquire into both of them and to feel whatever is arising in the body-mind as feedback, and to really heed that intuitive advice that's coming from the system. This consciousness is supremely intelligent, and the body is consciousness. It's not that there is a body that is conscious. The body is made of consciousness. It's the life that is weaving together the cells of your body. It's weaving together the tissues. It's beating your heart. It's breathing you. it's blinking your eyes and digesting your food and growing new cells after old ones are dying and replenishing itself constantly. It's nothing but intelligence, actually. There's no unconsciousness to the body. Actually, the body is full life. It's just aliveness, expressing and dancing. And the more that we can kind of tune into that and not feel like I am alive, not feel that I have a body, but that I am that. That's what I am. I refers to that conscious intelligence. And that's what started to sort of wake up here during this process, that non-separation from cosmic consciousness, which sounds rather grandiose and abstract, but it's right here in this lived experience, in this moment. It's not abstract at all. That's why I'm suggesting that we drop down with the attention into the felt sense of being consciousness. Not being conscious, but being consciousness. Because there's no one who's conscious. There's simply consciousness that's alive as the reality and the totality of everything that's arising. So that's one way to invite suffering closer, rather than trying to push it away or to anesthetize it, which is the norm in our culture, is to drink it away or drug it away, sex it away, in some way to deny it or to wallow in it, which is another possibility that happens a lot with depression. And there are many reasons and causes for that too, some physiological and there are biochemical reasons for that as well. But at the end of the day, the attitude with which we meet whatever arises determines our experience, the quality of it.
Yeah. This point is particularly germane in light of the opioid epidemic that's ravaging many parts of the country. It's like large numbers of people are trying to numb out, trying to stifle whatever it is they're feeling.
Yes.
And it seems very short-sighted, because obviously an opioid only lasts for a relatively short amount of time, and then you're going to feel even worse.
Yes.
But I guess people just don't feel like there's a light on the other side of the tunnel, And if they could somehow be guided to feel through whatever it was they're trying to stifle, I think they would find that it actually does clear up, and they feel way better than opioids could make them feel temporarily.
Yeah.
They feel better all the time than any drug could make them feel momentarily.
Well, we're all seeking abiding contentment. Everyone just wants to be at peace and happy in one way or another. Most of us do it unwisely because we don't know any better. We've never been taught what peace really is.
Right.
And so we seek momentary peace or pleasure. We seek passing pleasure as a way to feel a momentary sense of relief from the pain that we're feeling. But we all know, everyone knows innately that it doesn't last and it doesn't work. Sometimes we have to learn that lesson over and over again until we, as they say, hit rock bottom, and you can't do that anymore. The body won't let you do it.
Right.
It has given you enough signals so that it's time to wake up from that.
Yeah.
And so we might find ourselves in some recovery program, or we might find ourselves in satsang.
Yeah.
And I think getting fed up with suffering is actually important. It was important for me that there was a sense that I can't suffer anymore.
Well, let me ask you about that, because the account of your life you've given us so far didn't sound too horrific. You had this great education, you had a teaching job that many would envy. You seemed like a pretty happy guy, had all this sort of spiritual, the spiritual thing was dawning ever since you were a child, but then you said you definitely went through a sex, drugs, and rock and roll phase, so I'm not sure quite where that sits in the chronology of things.
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
All right.
Definitely wouldn't go that far.
But, there was an indulgence in things that you later needed to purify.
Just the normal garden variety indulgence.
Normal stuff,
that we all do, yeah.
Okay. So, and we talked about this whole purificatory phase that you went through. Maybe you want to talk more about it. But at a certain point, was there finally a sort of a breakthrough moment in which you would say you woke up? Some people say that they can mark it on a calendar. Other people say it snuck up on them.
It was both.
Okay.
It was both, which is why I don't talk about it in dogmatic terms, and I don't say it has to be one way or the other. As you know, and from our conversations, one of my mantras is "and both and neither."
Right.
Because I can't say it was a progressive unfolding. When I think about it and construct a story and a narrative, it seemed progressive. Of course, change and progress is mental. It has to be remembered and constructed and put together in order to have the story of me over time. Of course, all we ever experience is the eternal presence of awareness, which neither comes nor goes. But if I'm constructing a narrative of my life in time, which requires memory and imagination, there was this sense of the slow cook for 22 years of conscious slow cooking. Of course, it happened prior to that too, but that was
intentional for 22 years.
Yes, but there were also stations, which the Sufis use the word stations, like plateaus of understanding and insight, where you can't go back.
Yeah.
And there were shifts in understanding where understanding and experience would all coalesce and then click into place. And once that clicks, it's definitive. It's stable. Yeah. And yes. So there were moments towards the end of that purification process when there were 2 or 3 clicks where there was a shift from. It was a 180 actually, from feeling and thinking and being a separate self who was conscious, to realizing that I am consciousness and that's what I refers to. There was a moment of realization that I am the unbroken eternal continuity of pure awareness. And since then, thoughts, sensations, and perceptions have no sway. They're still there. But the understanding has clicked that they're just passing through, are made out of awareness, are passing through awareness, but that I refers to awareness, which neither comes nor goes. And so it's a literal 180 of understanding. Because prior to that, you feel like you are someone who's making progress and who comes in and out of it. And that sense has gone, of being someone who is kind of getting it and losing it, getting it and losing it, which is a common phase that happens. But there's no sense of losing myself now. I mean, it's an absolutely absurd idea to think that I could lose myself. It would be like thinking, I don't know. It just seems nonsensical to me at this point. There's no losing the self. The self, without conscious being, nothing could be. So it's the foundation and reality of whatever is. And that's and there was a stabilization during this process where that became just normal and natural again, and no big deal.
Yeah.
To be honest with you.
Speaking of Ajay again, I was listening to a recording just yesterday, I think, in which he was saying that, initially spiritual experiences and breakthroughs can seem amazing.
They do, they can.
Whoa. But we acclimate, and we eventually end up in a stable state, which doesn't seem like any big deal at all, which if we were to snap into it suddenly would seem like a big deal, but we acclimate.
We acclimate. Eckhart Tolle had his park bench years, where there was a period of settling into that shift.
Ramana had his cave years.
He did.
After his awakening.
20.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was quite a long time. And that period of time will be different for each one of us. But I do like to stress and emphasize that returning to the natural state, which you never actually left, really is natural. It's a natural stage of evolution, if you will. I mean, the ultimate realization is that the evolutionary path culminates in the realization that consciousness does not evolve. But that's a paradox.
Right.
And so there is and there isn't this evolutionary path.
It's maybe a paradox, but if we're really clear on what we're talking about, then consciousness doesn't evolve, but its expressions evolve, and the vehicles through which it's lived evolve.
Yeah.
Yes, it's like saying electricity is the same, but you have different wattages of light bulbs and different instruments and machines and all, which channel that electricity very differently, and they might evolve, over time with technological progress. In the case of that metaphor,
one of the tricks with evolution is that it sets up some goal. Like if we can agree to have evolution without a goal, post-awakening sadhana, for instance, I would make a differentiation between pre-awakening sadhana and post-awakening. Pre-awakening, you're really on a journey somewhere.
Yeah.
And you have an idea in your mind of what that will be. But post-awakening, this is complete. This is, in my experience in this moment, this is utter completion.
Yeah. And yet if I were to talk to you 20 years
perfect.
from now, you might say, whoa, it's just a lot more rich than it was 20 years ago, Now you're not sort of anticipating that or longing for that and all, because you're quite content now, which I think actually there is a thing where contentment becomes quite predominant and the whole seeking energy drops off because you just feel so content.
Yeah.
But that is, in my opinion, that is not to say that continued evolution of some sort doesn't happen. I think it does.
Yeah, it's a tricky one.
I mean, even in your own experience, I don't know when this awakening happened for you, but if you, to look back to when that was, do you feel like there's been a maturation, a deepening, a refinement, or something, in some relative sense? We're not implying that consciousness is changing anymore, but
or presence is not changing. I mean, by definition, presence is presence.
Right.
How could you have more or less presence, or a presence that's different than this one?
Yeah.
It's ridiculous, right? And you're laughing because you can see that.
I'm laughing because one time my wife and I went camping in Canyonlands National Park in Utah, and it's a rather foreboding place in a way. You have to really be prepared to get out into the boonies and explore the canyon without dying. And so we were sort of limited to our campsite and easy walks around that vicinity. And she went to the camp host and the park ranger guy, and she said, here we are in this vast national park, with all, and she said, is there any more, than this? And he kind of laughed and looked at her like, what more could there be? This is an amazing place.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that is realized, is that there can't be any more perfection than there is in this moment. That siren is absolutely what it is. It doesn't have to be changed or improved upon or gotten rid of. It is what it is. Everything is shining with the absolute radiance of pure awareness. And you'll never get more or less of that.
Right.
And that's part of the realization, is that it is absolute. Regardless of what's showing up, regardless of the circumstances, all circumstances are shining by the same presence of awareness. And it doesn't have any gradations in it itself. Now, at the same time, the body-mind does continue to refine, as you say, and to become more sensitive and perhaps transparent to truth, but it's not goal-oriented, and that's the key. It's not like the body is going to become some perfect bionic body. What is it that I would be striving to be like? What ideal would I set up that would be perfect for me to attain? Yeah. That's all mind projection. That's part of pre-awakening sadhana. Right. So if we could agree on a kind of post-awakening sadhana that I describe it as a timeless process of unfoldment, post-awakening sadhana. Timeless process. It's a paradox, meaning there's an awareness of the perfection of every moment as it is, and this is timeless. This moment is timeless, this presence. And there's this relative unfoldment in time towards more and more transparency of the body-mind, you could say, but not of awareness.
Yeah.
And it's not particularly going anywhere. It's just joyful. It's joyful to be. It's joyful to express creatively, to be, in relationship. But it doesn't have to be going, just like you don't listen to a symphony by Beethoven, you're not listening to it in order to get to the final note.
Right.
Like, I can't wait till the end of this, because that's going to, the whole thing is a joy. From at every moment that you're listening to it, it's complete. The joy is in the total absorption, and to be the beauty of that. That's what life is.
I think that's very natural. I think that if a person is bound and suffering and not liberated, not awake, there's a desperation to achieve relief from that.
Yes, which is natural.
And there's a very strong individual desire, to wake up,
Yes.
or at least there can be.
Yes.
But when waking up has taken place and there's a tremendous relief and contentment, and then one just can rest in that. And I don't think that the evolution stops at any point. It's just that God has sort of taken over in the driver's seat, and you can just relax and enjoy the ride. But santosh, contentment, becomes predominant enough that the whole seeking energy drops off. And there's
more energy for other things.
Yeah.
Like being of service, being in true relationship with friends and family and loved ones, whoever that might be.
A cup runneth over.
Yeah. Yes, that's such a beautiful. I mean, when the awakening was happening, there was such a feeling of plenitude.
Right.
What they would call the plenum. This overabundance of
Yeah.
overflowing abundance. I still see it everywhere. I can't see any boundary to this abundance. I can't see any edge or border to it. All I see is just fullness and emptiness at the same time, because it couldn't appear but for the emptiness in which it appears, by which it's known. This empty knowing, which it is. I mean, and it's, again, this is not abstract. If we try to look for awareness, we can never find it. There's an empty knowing, or an empty awaring, as Tony Packer, my first teacher, used to call it, awaring, to make it into a kind of a verb.
I think Paul Hederman says something like that too, doesn't he? He has some funny word.
Yeah.
But
he may. Yeah, there's that sense of aliveness to it, rather than awareness as this dead object, this thing. It's life. It's life itself, and there's no beginning or end to life, and that's just absolutely clear to me, that there's no beginning or end to what this is. And so the body takes on more of a universal proportions, because we do have an individual body in a relative sense, but that individual body is woven with its infinite environment. There's no beginning or end to the environment. It's part of an infinite network of being. Going back to my childhood question, what is on the other side of the universe when you get to it? And of course, the realization that dawned is there's no end to this. There's no beginning to this, but experientially that revealed itself. So that the body became non-separate from this beginningless and endless, whatever we call this, whatever this is. The body is both individual and universal. And that's when I think the real flow of being starts to really run through uninterruptedly and without any sort of kinks in it, that there's a sense of free fall or free flow, of just being this without finding any limitation to it, any border or any place where beingness can get, or consciousness can get snagged, or there's no sense of getting stuck. I mean, what would that even mean? Everything is change and flow and flux. Nothing gets stuck. Everything is fresh. It's just memory that gives the illusion that there's a sense of stuckness. But this is just totally new. This has never happened before, this feeling, the sensation. And there's a sense of joy about that, about just being awake to awakeness, which is all it is. It's just being awake to the fact that there is awakeness. It's being conscious of the fact that there is consciousness, which Nisargadatta would call the highest meditation, is to be aware of being aware, to be conscious of being conscious. And not a person being aware, but just awareness is aware of being aware. And that is so freeing. There's no me who's against experience anymore. There's just a flow of experience with no center. And that's the key. No center.
You told us about your time with Tony Packer and Philip Kapleau, but then I know we also have a picture of Nisargadatta here. You never met him in person, but you consider him your root teacher. Of all the pictures you could have brought, you brought this one.
Because this is the one that's in I Am That. And I was actually going to bring my copy of I Am That because it's the copy I've had for 22 years.
Yeah.
And it's completely...
dog-eared.
It's just... It's a mess. I mean, but I can't get rid of it. And this is the picture that was in that. And I've just lived with that picture for 22 years. So that's why I chose that one out of all the others. So yeah, he discovered me when I think I was 18, and I think it was Tony Packer who introduced me to him. Yeah. And there was just an immediate resonance, and he just completely seized my being, and the power, the incredible power and insight that came through was just unparalleled. And I've had a lot of great teachers, including Ramana, but there's no one for me who compares to the crystal clarity of Nisargadatta, to his transmission through I Am That, which is remarkable if you think about the fact that that's translated from his original language by Morris Friedman, and the power is still full force. I mean, you feel like you're sitting there in his little studio in Bombay, and that he could be smoking beedies right in front of you. It's that powerful that it has an incredible transmission, and it always will for anybody who encounters that text. It's a living, breathing text, and it has the power to shift consciousness and to trigger realizations in a way that I have never seen in anything else. But we're all different. For some people, that might come in talks with Ramana Maharshi. Sure. Or it might come in, any number of ways. But for me, it was definitive. And it found the foundation for everything else that came. I just lived him throughout the whole process. And when it seemed dark and pointless and altogether futile, I would always turn to him. And there would always be a sense that this is possible. I knew it was true. I knew it was true immediately, and the whole way through, although it took a long time to come to that realization for myself. And then later I met Rupert Spira and became deeply, deeply touched by his pointings, particularly at the path of inclusion and his extraordinary descriptions of the nature of consciousness and how there are no objects in experience, and consciousness is the reality of what we call objectivity. He was profoundly influential for me. And I had a number of key awakenings through my engagement with his work, and I still draw in many ways from him, even though I've developed a different way of talking and expressing this. There are some really important, understandings that came through him, but he was prepared by Nisargadatta. And then the other one was Mooji, who was such an overwhelmingly powerful force, just as Rupert was. They were both sort of working synergistically in very different ways, because they're such different expressions. They're rather opposites in a lot of ways, but Mooji really helped to clarify the nature of pure awareness, and to open up the heart, to the wellspring of love, unconditional love, and affection, and creativity, and spontaneity, and intuition. All these things came from Rupert too. They were sort of both contributing, like the yin and the yang, towards some full understanding that was founded on my engagement with Nisargadatta, which was the foundation for that. And so it was. I'm just a tremendous amount of gratitude to all three of them, really.
Great.
Yeah.
So you've written a book, and some people who will be watching this in a few years can buy that book now if they want to, but those who watch it right after I put it up might have to wait a year.
Yeah, it's going to take a little while.
Still in the works.
Yes.
But I think you're going to set up, you may have set up on your website by the time this airs, a way of signing up to be notified when the book is published. I would recommend that.
Yeah.
What's the book about?
The book is tentatively titled The Uncreated Light of Awareness. It's been accepted by Non-Duality Press, which has recently been acquired by New Harbinger. So it'll take about a year to come out, and it's a book that examines the nature of awareness from the perspective of experience. And it contains a lot of experiential contemplations and meditations that lead the reader into the direct realization of boundless awareness, and to have that become established as the natural state. And then there's, kind of a deconstruction of the psychological self and a kind of a reestablishment back in the seat of awareness. And then there's a chapter on integration where this is kind of taken into our normal everyday lives so that it's lived in, the midst of fire and pressure, so that it becomes really, our lives become saturated with it, this understanding at every level, and that there's nothing that's left out, and there's no sense that, truth is not applicable to some aspect of life, that it really, everything becomes saturated in the understanding, and that we're able to live and relate as love, which is at the end of the day what it's all about.
Great.
Yeah.
So you have alluded to working with people and with groups
Yes.
and stuff like that, and you live in the Bay Area. But people will be listening to this from all over the world. So do you do like Skype sessions with people and all?
I do regular Skype sessions with people, which work remarkably well. Actually, one of the most beautiful things to come out of the work I've been doing with people on Skype is the realization when I'm working with someone of this presence that we've been talking about. People who are in Australia and India and in just all corners of the world, when we tune in together, there is no distance, literally. It's the same presence. It's like falling into a wormhole, and it just connects, these two seemingly disparate people in space and time into this non-dual presence, which is so warm and juicy and loving. And it's been just a beautiful experience. So I've been doing a lot of that, and also doing online satsangs, and we're putting together some satsangs in person, and also doing retreats. I'm giving a retreat in Greece,
Greece.
In July.
Nice.
7-day retreat there, and be some satsangs in London, and more to come.
Great.
So people can check all that out on the events page on my website.
Which is?
boundlessawareness.org.
boundlessawareness.org. No hyphen.
No hyphen.
Okay, great. So thanks, Michael. This has been great. I really
Thank you,
enjoyed
Rick.
talking to you. We should do it more often.
I would love that.
And thanks to those who've been listening or watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. As most of you probably know, this is an ongoing series. And if you would like to be notified of future ones, there's a mailing list you can sign up for at batgap.com. If you'd like to check out past ones, go into the past interviews menu, and you'll see hundreds of them organized and categorized in various ways. And check out the other menus too, because there are a lot of interesting little things, and we keep adding stuff as time goes along. I started a quotes section whenever somebody sends me a quote, or I come across a great little quote that I think that I find inspiring, I'm adding it in a categorized kind of a way. We have a glossary of non-dual terms that someone sent me that I put up there. There's a geographical index where you can type in a city such as London, and you'll see what's coming up in London among all the people I've interviewed. You'll see, once Michael puts in his information, you'll see the details about Michael's visit to London, and a bunch of other stuff. So just check out the menus, and we hope to continue making this a more and more valuable resource for spiritual seekers and people in general everywhere. So see you next time.